Hello, everybody out there. I hope everyone is safe. I hope everyone is happy as you can be given these circumstances, and hope everyone's doing well. Welcome again. My name is Kevin Impellizzeri. My pronouns are he, him, his. You can also call me Doctor. And welcome to This Isn't Pac-Man Anymore, the 1993 Moral Panic over video games. It is our 8-part series that is attempting to answer the question of how did video games get age ratings in the United States. We're past the halfway point, and we're getting really into the real big details of how we got video game age ratings in the U.S. Um, as I said at the outset, there was a moment in time that set up the circumstances that ended up with video games getting ESRB ratings, and we're making our way towards it ever closer every episode. Um, for those of you who are coming in and are new to the series, welcome. And if you have missed an episode, I've got a link to the full series, which is a playlist now, down in the description. But just to give you a brief recap of the episodes that we've done so far, the first episode we did 5 weeks ago. My goodness, how long it's been. Hopefully quarantine isn't driving anyone mad. Even as the walls start to close in on me, I feel like I'm mostly still there. But we asked the question of what is a moral panic initially, going over some basic terminology and examining some examples of moral panics. And in the second episode, we addressed the question of what were anxieties of video games like before 1993 and this moral panic over video games. And then the last previous 2 weeks, we covered two notable tech / media / entertainment fads that were going on roughly around the same time. Those are the virtual reality craze and full motion video or FMV games. Today, we're going to tackle part 5. So welcome. As part 5, we'll examine the crime panic of 1993 and 1994. Just a couple of disclaimers before we start. I've got some content warnings on the side, as you can see. We're going to be discussing violent crime, such as murder, rape, assault, mass shootings, gun violence, and we're going to talk about mass incarceration along the way. And with that, I just want to tell you all in advance a disclaimer. This one's going to be a real talk episode. This is a very special episode of This Isn't Pac-Man Anymore because we're going to talk about some really important topics that resonate into the present day. Such as what we're going to cover today is we're going to examine concerns over violent crime in 1993 and 1994 and evaluate them in terms of moral panic theory. And we'll get into that in a moment. We're going to assess the legacy of the crime panic and what the concerns over crime in early 1993-94, what did they mean for the time, but also how that panic resonates into the present. And with it, we're going to talk about the relationship of the crime panic to popular media of the time, and that will then lead us into the intersection between the crime panic and the panic over video games. So, what's great in education is this idea of referring back to previous concepts, because you want to reinforce what people are learning. That's a little bit what we try to do. You introduce a concept, and you apply examples of that, and then you assess a person's knowledge of it, and then you can reinforce those things. So for those of you who recall our first episode, we examined moral panic theory and what were the definitions of a moral panic. But I'll just give you a brief refresher on moral panics. With our definition that we're doing for moral panic is a sudden backlash against a perceived threat to the moral order, the general impact of which is overstated or even non-existent. Moral panics are waged by individuals and groups that are described as moral entrepreneurs, or who are the actors who wage moral panics. And moral entrepreneurs direct their ire against what can be called a folk devil, a target of a moral panic that embodies concerns of moral decay, that it becomes the embodiment of whatever specific concern or anxiety that they're addressing. And if you'll recall, we described that moral panics have 5 characteristics, which were introduced by Eric Good and Nachman Ben Yehuda in their studies of moral panics. They gave 5 characteristics, which were concern, which is a heightened anxiety over some perceived threat to the moral order. And that concern is met with hostility. Moral panics are generally anti-movements, anti-suggestive rock and roll lyrics, anti-video games, anti-violent crime. And that the moral entrepreneurs who wage this concern and hostile campaigns against them reach a consensus about the threat of that specific thing. They agree that that threat exists, that it's having this impact on people in some way or society, and that something needs to be done about it. But the concern and the target of the moral panic is often disproportionate in terms of its impact. And this disproportionality is the idea that the actual threat to the moral order is overstated, or in some cases, does not exist. And as an example, to the right, we talked about this in our first episode, the satanic panic and the concern over Dungeons and Dragons, particularly the concern that Dungeons and Dragons was a gateway into the occult. And if you want to learn more about that, feel free to check out my previous episode from a few weeks ago. But this is a textbook example of a disproportionate moral panic. And moral panics are also volatile. They often capture the public consciousness in very short, concentrated periods. And then the concerns don't go away, but they kind of lose the moment. They lose that attention. And attention shifts to other things. People lose interest or they move on to other threats, real or perceived. So that's going to help us understand the rest of what we're talking about today, because we're talking about a specific panic here, one specifically focused around crime. Because in 1993 and 94, there was a sudden and extremely active concern over violent crime, which came out a lot in news media and press coverage. Press coverage of violent acts of crime, things like gun violence, gangs, drugs, the impact of violence, violent television, and violent media, particularly things on children, on our perceptions of violence, whether or not we're being desensitized, whether or not people are carrying out violent acts. There's a huge focus on this between 1993 and 1994. I'm going to be citing a lot a criminal justice scholar by the name of Ted Chiricos, who was focused both on criminality and mass incarceration, and actually did a paper on this in the mid-1990s, examining media coverage of violence and violent crime and juvenile violence and other aspects of violence, and polls, particularly Gallup polls, and where they rank crime. And he saw, and this is a graph from his article here I've cited down in the bottom left, that particularly by late 1993 and into early 1994, we're seeing a significant spike in articles that are covering violence in some way, shape, or form. As you can see, we see a start of a slight increase from June into September, and then by October and into November, it skyrockets and remains high into 1994. Public opinion polls at the time ranked crime as the most important issue in the United States. In fact, to give you some raw data, Chiricos in his coverage of Gallup polls said that between January 1993 and January 1994, there was a 400% increase in people rating violent crime as the most important issue in America. And he saw a 400% increase in media coverage as well. So to hear news coverage discuss it, you would think that we were in the midst of a massive crime wave. And in fact, examples of stories that you would hear at the time, for example, a series of assaults on tourists in Florida led U.S. News to christen the Sunshine State as the State of Rage in an October 1993 article. The October 1st, 1993 kidnapping and murder of Polly Klaas, who was a young girl, a 13-year-old girl from Petaluma, California. She was snatched during a slumber party 12 years old, my apologies, was snatched during a slumber party and later was murdered, grabbed national headlines, and the search for Polly was a big topic of media coverage in late 1993, as well as a series of high-profile mass shootings, particularly in December of 1993. On December 2nd, 1993, Alan Winterborn opened fire in unemployment offices in Oxnard and Ventura, California, killing 5 people and injuring several others before being gunned down by police in what the Los Angeles Times described as, quote, the bloodiest shooting spree in Ventura County history. Not to make light of this, to think how far we've come in terms of these concerns over mass shootings, that was the most bloodiest compared to things that happen now. 5 days later, Colin Ferguson, my apologies, opened fire in a crowded Long Island commuter train, killing 6 and wounding 19, which prompted Time magazine to have this cover you see on their December 20th, 1993 issue, with an image of Colin Ferguson behind an image of a handgun with the headline, "Enough! The massacre on a suburban New York train escalates the war over handguns." Television specials from the time focused on violent crime, drugs, gang violence, and guns. For example, MTV aired on December 9, 1993, a special called Generation Under the Gun. NBC, on January 26, 1994, aired their own called America the Violence. And this penetrated into popular media as well, with one example being the well-regarded Disney animated show Gargoyles, which had an episode that aired on November 18, 1994, called Deadly Force, in which the gargoyle Brooklyn finds the officer Felicia's handgun and tries to play around with it and accidentally shoots and wounds her. And talking about this idea of guns, responsible gun ownership, and the impact of guns in society. Tom Morgenthau, going back to the news coverage of guns, said, quote, "Guns are everywhere, and they are being used in increasingly horrific ways." And going back to a previous slide I mentioned here, this line at the end, the epidemic of violence, because much of the characterization, both in the press, in political officials of the time, characterized this as an epidemic of violence. For example, speaking before a Senate subcommittee hearing on rap music in February 1994, Robert T. M. Phillips of the American Medical Association proclaimed violence, quote, "is pandemic in this country and is our greatest health crisis." Senator William S. Cohen of Maine observed, quote, "Leaders of the healthcare community have begun to call violence a public health threat on a par with tuberculosis, cancer, and AIDS." And other descriptions of violence at the time use such terms as the coarsening of America, as Senator John C. Danforth of Missouri described in October 1993 when he said, the fact that not only are people shooting people, children are shooting children. The collapse of the American family, the constant parade of stories of sex offenses by teachers against children, and on it goes. In his weekly radio address following the Long Island shooting, President Bill Clinton observed the shooting and other incidents, quote, "has left Americans insecure on our streets, in our schools, even in our homes." But we have an epidemic we're talking about here, and as it turns out, this series you're watching now is taking place during a pandemic. And so leads you to think about comparisons and how would we analyze something of being an epidemic of violence. And one simple way seems to be statistically. Let's go to the raw data. Let's go beyond the headlines and go what the statistics on crime were saying during the period. Was there, the big question we're going to ask, was there a sudden surge in violent crime? Were there huge spikes in incidents of crime that would necessitate this response, that something has to be done about it? And the short answer is no. Statistically, these are the statistics. These are based on the U.S. Department of Justice Uniform Crime Reporting statistics. reporting violent crime rates in the United States from 1989 through 2014. And you'll see that while crime rates were on the rise through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, but if you look, particularly let's focus on 1991 and 1992, because of the point we're saying is like middle of 1993, we're seeing that, well, rates were going up into 1991, with 91 being the high on this chart we're seeing here. And after that high, they were slowly going down. And even if rates were higher compared to, say, 1989, the crime rates in 1993 were not significantly higher than they were in previous years. In fact, they were lower. And stretching further into the timeline, they were part of a steady decline in crime that continued into the early 2000s. If we break this down even further, you can see here I've got a couple of other charts here. This is the U.S. murder rate on the right from the same time period. And like with the violent crime rate, we're seeing that there was a slight uptick in the late 80s into the early 1990s with a peak in 1991. But as we can see, they're not the numbers in 1992 and 1993 are not that statistically different than they were in 1991. And in fact, we're, with the exception of 92 and 1993, we're beginning a downward decline. And this is, for example, also in the U.S. robbery rates, which again saw a spike in about 1991, and we're beginning to taper off and decline from 1992 into 93 and 94. And also the U.S. aggravated assault rate doing a similar thing. So the short answer is no, there wasn't an epidemic of violence, statistically speaking. And the long answer is also no. Crime rates were not significantly higher in 1993, especially given the 400% increase in media coverage of them. So let's go back to that question of moral panics. I said that this was a moral panic initially, but let's apply the moral panic theory to it. Our 5 characteristics of a moral panic, again: concern, hostility, consensus, disproportionality, and volatility. As you've seen from these lines from the press and from political leaders, there's certainly a concern. So yes to concern. There's a hostility to it. We need to stop this violent crime. The corseting of America, as one senator described. And there's a consensus that there is a problem. Violent crime rates are too high, that they need to be curtailed. There's this agreement that there is a problem, a big issue with this. And the media coverage seems to suggest that that narrative is outpacing any other counter-narratives to that. For example, again, that it wasn't statistically significant, which gets us back into the disproportionality question, that the response is disproportionate to the actual reality of violent crime rates in the United States at that time period. And this is skipping a little bit further ahead. We're going to find that this kind of concentrated focus, both politically and in terms of press coverage, ended up not sustaining itself beyond about a year and began to taper off in 1994. So definitely skipping ahead does fit the volatility metric as well. So this is why I say this was a moral panic, and other people like Ted Chiricos have done as well. And I encourage you to check out his work on the subject. But nevertheless, like with moral panics, there is an emphasis in the narrative over the violent crime panic that something must be done. This violence must be curtailed. To paraphrase a line from a senator during one of the video game hearings, says we need to do something to curtail this culture of carnage, he called it. It was Senator Herbert Cole of Minnesota who said that. So what we're going to do is we're going to see what was done about it. And before that, I'm just going to step back for a moment and say, like, one interesting question about this is, why did this moral panic happen when it did? Why is there this big concern over violent crime in 1993 and not, say, 91 or 92, when it did reach at the time its highest numbers? And it's hard to say. Chirico suggests that it just might have been a slow news cycle. And one easy way to get headline to attract readers, to attract newspaper sales, magazine sales, to attract TV viewers is to basically scare the hell out of people. And what's an easy way to get particularly suburban white families scared? Say that violent crime from the cities is invading their suburbs. And in fact, a common narrative was the idea of gangs, gun violence, or drugs were invading America, particularly American suburbs. These ideas of creep into suburbia. The gangs are making their way into your suburbs to concern particularly white middle class viewers into watching more and demanding something be done about this. So let's focus a little bit on what was done about this. Because this took a lot of different angles. One of the biggest ones, however, we'll talk about is federal legislation. Between 1993 and 1994, there were two very significant pieces of gun control and crime control legislation. The first we're going to talk about is the image that's on the left-hand side, which is the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. The nickname of it was the Brady Bill. It was initially introduced in the mid-1980s. It was named after James Brady, who was President Ronald Reagan's press secretary. The two of them, as well as one of his security details, were shot by John Hinckley Jr. During his assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan on March the 30th, 1981. The attack had left Brady paralyzed. And several people in Washington tried to use what had happened to Reagan and to Brady as a way of advocating for greater gun legislation. It kind of sputtered out, thanks in no small part to lobbying by the National Rifle Association in the 1980s. But a new version of the bill surfaced in 1993 and was signed into law by President Clinton on November the 30th, 1993. The other big piece of legislation was the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, known then as the Crime Bill, which was signed into law on September the 13th, 1994. This law dramatically expanded the authority of law enforcement officials and imposed tighter penalties for various forms of crime. It was a huge bill. There were a lot of pieces to it. It was 356 pages. This is a massive piece of legislation. Included in were things like resources to expand the federal prison system, imposed longer sentences for violent crimes, especially things like hate crimes. It imposed the three strikes policy for federal crimes. Three strikes laws are laws where if a person has three felony convictions, the third felony conviction results in an automatic life sentence without parole. It also expanded the use of the death penalty at the federal level. It also imposed federal restrictions on assault weapon purchases. When you hear discussions, particularly when it comes to gun control and mass shootings, and people talk about the assault weapons ban, that was part of the crime control, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act as well. It was in place for about 10 years. That particular provision of the bill. The bill also enacted a truth in sentencing program that incentivized states to keep people incarcerated for at least 85% of their sentence and helped to limit access to things like early release and parole. Truth in sentencing laws had been around before that, with the idea that if a person, say, sentenced to 10 years in prison, that the state puts it as close to 10 years as possible. In this case, the crime bill had it that a person had to serve about 85% of their sentence before they could even be considered for early release. And this bill gave the green light for states to impose similar tough-on-crime measures at the state level. So, for example, just as the federal government enacted a three strikes policy, like I said, third felony conviction results in an automatic life sentence, states introduced ones of their own. The first was actually Washington State, which got ahead of the federal government with theirs taking effect on December 2nd, 1993. In 1994, 13 states enacted a three strikes policy, followed by another 9 in 1995. In fact, California established their three strikes law in 1994, in part due to public outcry over the poly-class kidnapping, because the person who had perpetrated it had been convicted multiple times in the past of felonies. Again, going further into other measures that were going on at the time, things like mandatory minimum sentencing become more common in the early 1990s, with the idea that certain crimes, such as drugs, such as violent things like assault, murder, require a mandatory minimum sentence of a certain amount of time before a person, that if they're convicted of that crime, then they're automatically given that time. So, for example, if, say, for armed robbery, it's 3 years, then they have to serve for 3 years at least, and could serve for longer. And with that were also extensions of sentences, longer sentencing. And again, as I mentioned a few moments ago, truth in sentencing laws that go along with this as well. And at the time, you have politicians who run on tough on crime measures. And tough on crime measures in general have pretty broad bipartisan support. So it's not necessarily at the time one particular political party advocating over the other. It was an easy vote getter. It's hard to run on a campaign that says you're not going to be hard on crime. And it made a lot of convenient ways for opponents to say someone was soft on crime as a way of scoring political points on their opponents. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Because the crime panic had long ramifications. Because one of the biggest results of this was the incarceration rate in the U.S. skyrocketed. Now, before I talk more about what's on the screen here, I will say that the crime panic in 93 and 94 was not the only reason that incarceration rates went up so substantially in the United States. They were part, the panic and the legislation that was after it, things like the crime bill, things like truth in sentencing laws and mandatory minimum sentences and three strikes laws, were part of a larger system of tough on crime measures that date to the 1970s with the beginning of the war on crime and the war on drugs, which escalated into the 1980s and then into the 1990s. Incarceration rates were already going up in the 1980s and continue to accelerate, in part because of crackdowns on drugs in particular, with things like crack cocaine, which was also part of a similar moral panic, where the actual impact of those drugs was actually not as high as advocates in the press and politicians were saying. However, these resulted in a significant spike in the incarceration rate. For example, according to a 1996 Justice Department report on truth in sentencing laws specifically, state drug-related arrests increased by 1990 to just over 1 million arrests by 1990. And as you can see, the incarceration rates in general increased substantially. As I said, they already increasing steadily, but they explode during this time period. So, for example, in 1971, there were only about 196,092 people in state and federal prisons in the United States. Today, there are about 2.2 million. See the substantial increase. And to help us illustrate that, because I like graphs, and one of the best ones is this one that it's affectionately known, Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site here in Philadelphia, by its tourist staff as the Big Graph. The graph is a model. It's a 16-foot tall, 3,500-pound plate steel model that demonstrates incarceration rates in the United States from 1900 to 2010, separated by decade. The small red bar that you see in the center represents roughly when Eastern State Penitentiary closed. It closed in 1972. In 2010, roughly where we are today, these being indicated by U.S. Census data. They actually have a spot next to the 2010 bar that will allow for when the 2020 census is completed to keep the data up to date. When this was completed, the U.S. incarceration rate was 2.3 million people. I will give full disclosure that I did used to work at Eastern State Penitentiary, so I'm pulling some of that data, and also giving a shout out to some of my former coworkers as well. So we see a substantial increase in the arrest and incarceration rate. And let's talk specifically for a moment about the 1990s, because according to the American Sentencing Project, in 1992, right before this crime panic, there were about 846,277 people incarcerated in U.S. state and federal prisons. By 1994, that number had gone up to 1,016,691. That's roughly a 20% increase in the U.S. prison population in only 2 years. By 2000, there were 1.3 million people in prison and reached its peak and continued to increase until 2009 when it reached 1.6 million. Then there was a slight decrease and it started to increase again to the 2.3, 2.2 million we're at today. So as a result of this, the United States has by far the largest incarceration rate of any country on earth. The graph actually has 3 sides. We saw one side here. This, on the one side of the graph, shows the rate of incarceration among nations per 100,000 people. And as you can see, the United States by far is the largest. At the time, Rwanda was second. I believe El Salvador is now second, but correct me if I'm wrong. But either way, the United States is head and shoulders above other countries in terms of its incarceration rate. The U.S. has about 5% of the total global population, yet the U.S. also has about 22% of the world's prisoners. This, and the thing to understand is that these numbers are high. They're extremely high. They're extremely high compared to the United States was some 50 years ago. But while these numbers are high, they disproportionately affect certain Americans over others. For example, most notably is that the prison system and the mass incarceration system in the United States disproportionately affected and continue to affect people of color and low-income people. African Americans, for example, despite representing only 37% of the total U.S. population, represent about 67% of its prison population. This is an example on the reverse side of the graph showing the breakdown by race, particularly race from 1970 and then to the present day. African American men, this is according to the U.S. Sentencing Project, who were born since 2001, have a 1 in 3 chance of ending up in prison, compared to 1 in 17 of their white counterparts. And so these numbers are disproportionately affecting certain people over others, again, especially people of color and African Americans bearing the brunt, particularly black men. And incarceration extends in other places too, not just beyond what people who have been convicted of crimes or are currently serving time in prison. For example, according to the Prison Policy Initiative, there are roughly 550,000 people being held in pretrial detention, awaiting trial in jail because they can't afford bail to be released before their trial. So they're effectively being, over 500,000 people are being held in the United States without charge or trial. And incarceration issues extend beyond people who are being held and detained in jails and in prisons in the United States, because people who leave prison face a lot of challenges. It's very hard for them to re-enter not just normal civilian life, but also just the civic life, economic life. Felony convictions can take away a person's voting rights. In some states, people with certain felony convictions will never get their voting rights back. And in fact, 1.6 million Americans cannot vote today due to felony conviction. And again, this disproportionately affects people of color. For example, 1 out of every 13 African American adults in the United States cannot vote due to felony disfranchisement. This is compared to 1 out of 56 of all other demographic groups. In fact, in 4 U.S. states, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, at least 20%, 1 in 5 out of all African American adults, cannot vote because of a prior felony conviction. Felony convictions extend to other things, especially hard on people who have drug convictions. Felony drug convictions like possession or things like intent to sell, and can bar people from things like military service, barring them from student loans and other college financial aid. If you have a drug conviction, you cannot apply for the free application for federal student aid, and you're thus ineligible for pretty much all financial aid in the United States, because even independent scholarship programs require FAFSA. And other public assistance, things like food stamps, housing, employment, can be barred because of felony conviction, especially things like drug convictions. So this panic that happened it happened almost 30 years ago, has a huge impact on American society, even up to this day. It resonates now. We're still facing the consequences of that. And there's still many people who are dealing with this, and in some cases, disproportionately over other Americans. And like I said at the outset, that there's plenty of blame to go around for this. Tough on crime measures date back, in some ways, back to, you could say date back to the 1970s, but you can even say going further back to emancipation in the 1860s. With tough on crime measures imposed on free blacks at the time. And even going back, you can say the roots of slavery in the United States as having a connection into mass incarceration. Because you can't deny that there is an impact on people of color. And then in many cases, in some cases, these kinds of measures are racially motivated. And the way that they're pressed are often advocating for are predicating on fears of certain ethnic groups. I'll give you an example around the same time. In 1988, during the 1988 presidential election, we saw tactics of concerns over tough on crime. A big part of George H.W. Bush, then vice president, Republican nominee for president, his campaign was arguing that he was tough on crime and that his opponent, the Democratic nominee, who was Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, was in fact soft on crime. And for example, the Bush campaign and advocates for the Bush campaign read a series of ads emphasizing crime as a key issue that they were divided on. So, for example, Willie Horton, who was a man who had been incarcerated in Massachusetts, who had escaped prison during a weekend furlough program, which was in place in Massachusetts and other states. He escaped from prison at the time and went on to rape a woman in Maryland. And Willie Horton's face was put in one particularly notable ad by the National Security Political Action Committee, which aired between September and October 1988, which cut between Willie Horton's mugshot and Michael Dukakis' face, trying to create a strong association between this violent crime and Dukakis, and saying that similar things would happen with him. And there was an undeniable racial component with this, showing this African-American man who was in this mugshot, who had been a violent criminal, and associating this with criminality and violence, and using what are known today as dog whistle tactics, and playing on racial fears and anxieties, particularly for white voters, being fearful of these things. And while the ad was eventually pulled after criticism, the Bush campaign ran another one called the Revolving Door ad, which first aired on October the 8th, 1988, which showed a line of people in prison outfits going into a prison, going through a revolving door, and coming back out the other side. And the 30-second ad had the following narration over it, which said, quote, "As governor, Michael Dukakis vetoed mandatory sentences for drug dealers. He vetoed the death penalty. His revolving door prison policy gave weekend furloughs to first-degree murderers not eligible for parole. While out, many committed other crimes like kidnapping and rape, and many are still at large. Now Michael Dukakis says he wants to do for America what he's done for Massachusetts. America can't afford that risk. And while it doesn't say Willie Horton specifically, it is very clearly trying to resonate that idea of violent criminals. So that is to say that the crime panic has a significant impact, but it was part of this larger system of things that were going on. But I just want to say again, like I said at the beginning, this was a real talk episode. So where do we go from here? So this idea of tougher on crime measures was one significant portion of the crime panic. However, there were numerous offshoots of the crime panic, with moral entrepreneurs targeting specific issues related to it, many of them trying to strike while the political and while the media iron is hot, and trying to emphasize on other issues that they thought were connected to crime. And campaigns targeted a variety of potential causes for the crime panic and for the perceived deterioration of society, which include things like curtailing access to guns, curbing gang violence. There were concerns that unemployment with connections to violence. There were people who said that it was the perceived deterioration of the American family, decline in family values, and you can take whatever meanings you'd like to take from that. And maybe we're not praying enough or whatever. With that concern, and with the concern going in so many directions to address the violence, it invariably went towards violence in the media. So, as I said, concerns about violence in society then fueled concern over violence in the media. What impact is media having? Is depictions of violence and murder and mayhem and all of that stuff, are they a reflection of society? That we're in a violent society that is reflecting this back on us? Or are they causing crime? And a lot of concerns over violence in the media, one were the concern how often they're being depicted, with some organizations even trying to document what they call instances of violence. What does violence mean? About the concern over violence in the media often focus on desensitization or replication. So on the one hand, are depictions of media real crime? And the other part of that is, are people being influenced by the media? Are they seeing acts of violence, and are they carrying them out themselves? If someone sees a brutal murder depicted in popular media, are they then going to go do that themselves? Is the media turning people into killers? Becomes a big question with the concern of violence in the media. And we're going to see that's still something today. We're going to talk about it in a later episode about the resonance of these kinds of concerns. And as a result, there are campaigns against music, television, film, video games have become one of them as well. And this notable quote from James Cuello, who was a longtime commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, who at the time in 1993, when he submitted a statement before Congress, was the acting chairman of the FCC. He said, "America's epidemic of violence in 1992 and 1993 must be brought under control." Congress, for example, held hearings investigating the possible effects of violent television and the impact of gangster rap. The television one was held on October the 20th, 1993, and the gangster rap one was on February 23rd, 1994. So during all of these concerns over violence. So what we're going to do next is talk about a couple of specific targets in the media regarding depictions of violence. The first of which is Beavis and Butthead, the MTV animated show developed by Mike Judge. One of the things they talk about a lot is fire and Beavis saying fire, and depictions of that kind of stuff. In October of 1993, parents and law enforcement officials blamed Beavis and Butthead for a fire in Moraine, Ohio, wherein 5-year-old Austin Messner burned down his parents' mobile home, killing his infant sister. In response to criticism of this, NTV removed all instances of fire being depicted in the show, including Beavis saying "fire, fire." Moved the show's time slot from 7 p.m. To the less child-friendly 11 o'clock p.m. And added this disclaimer at the beginning, with kind of a tongue-in-cheek dig at the concerns over it, saying that Beavis and Butthead are not role models, they're not even human, they're cartoons. Some of the things they do would cause a person to get hurt, expelled, arrested, possibly deported. To put it another way, don't try this at home. Another target of activist criticism at the time is probably one that's less well known. I mean, I'm not really sure how many people, again, under the age of 35, really know about or even care about Beavis and Butthead anymore. But the film The Program from 1993 is probably even less well known, at least at this point. This stars some big actors. James Caan was in it, Halle Berry, Omar Epps, Craig Sheffer, others. And there's a scene in The Program where a bunch of teens lie down in the middle of a busy street. And after teenager Michael Shingledecker died from injuries sustained after being run over while lying down in the middle of a Polk, Pennsylvania road, critics cited the film The Program as an inspiration for his act that led to his death. And we see her headline from an October 19th, 1993 edition of the New York Times, which covered Shingledecker's death, saying, "Not like the movie, a dare leads to death." So these are some examples, but it is talking about this time period as someone who is 36 years old now. You can't help but be a little bit autobiographical and try to see where you were and how this impacted you. The way this impacted me and some other people of my age was not necessarily The Program. I certainly had never heard of it then. It may have been Beavis and Butthead, although I was never really interested in watching it at the time. But one that impacted me, and one that's notable from this time as well, is Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Power Rangers was developed by Hayao Saban, was adapted for the 10th season of Super Sentai, a popular Japanese henshin show from Japan, which involved superheroes who would battle the forces of evil, who would also use giant mecha and giant robots to fight giant monsters. Saban adapted scenes from Super Sentai and interspersed them with scenes of Western actors to put together Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and it was a big hit in 1993 and into 1994. And still going strong now with versions of Power Rangers still continuing, including a popular comic book line as well, which I hear very good things about, actually. It was a big deal at the time. It was a huge piece of youth popular culture, particularly among boys like me at the time. But it did raise concerns about violence. I'll show some headlines in a minute. But I also, again, as a fanboy of this, I have to say that Mighty Morphin Power Rangers also granted the world the Dragon Zord in Titanus, the Carrier Zord. And the popularity of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers also spawned a bunch of similar shows and imitators, some of them developed by Saban, and some of them developed by other people. And here are some examples. I did promise when I was plugging for this some Power Rangers inspired things from the deep recesses of the 1990s, hitherto forgotten. And so, for example, Saban followed up Power Rangers with VR Troopers, which followed a similar model of borrowing from a Japanese show and interspersing American actors. And I mentioned this one already in the past, in a few episodes ago, when I talked about virtual reality. I talked about Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad. Wow, my goodness, the alliteration and what people borrowed from Power Rangers, both the long names and these kind of alliterative titles. But for those who forgot, Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad had involved characters who jumped into the digital domain. It was an Ultraman type show where they fought monsters of the week with this giant superhero called Servo and various robot allies who were piloted by his friends like Draco and Xenon. Actually, Draco and Xenon were the ones that combined with them, but that's a whole nother story. Or no, I'm wrong. Draco and Xenon were their friends. Anyway, brief mental lapse. I say the mind is the first thing to go. In addition to Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad, was the amazingly titled Tattooed Teenage Alien Fighters from Beverly Hills, which ran for 40 episodes. I do admit to watching this, though not for 40 episodes back when I was a kid, when it came out in 1994. Mostly I was drawn into that title. It certainly was by the character costume designs. And another, going in the alliteration, my God, the alliteration of these shows, Big Bad Beetleborgs, another Saban property. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about another inspired one from 1997. This is delving into the dregs of the 90s, Vampires. From 1997, a computer animated show which did not run for as long as Big Bad Beetleborgs or Tattooed Teenage Alien Fighters from Beverly Hills did. This lasted only 13 episodes. The premise of this is 14s protect the world from the evil Dracula and his legion of evil vampires. They were basically sentient robot cars who fed on gasoline instead of blood. Their heroes were called the Motivators, and the evil vampires they fought. Random bit of trivia about this. The evil Dracula was voiced by Jonathan Davis, who was the frontman of Korn. So if you want to go dig that up, I believe someone's put them on YouTube at this point. And of course, there were anxieties over Mortal Kombat and its depictions of violence and what that meant for youth. Were they going to act out punching and kicking and violent acts? And some, I know some local areas would ban materials from Power Rangers in schools with a concern over violence. So it happens around the same time with all of these other concerns. But so with concerns over things like violent crime, things like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, things like the program, Beavis and Butthead, in this climate, moral anxieties over violence in the media inevitably turn to video games. We see conversations about violence in games during the time. Such as, for example, September 27th, 1993 issue of Time covered the popularity of video games. You see the cover here on the left-hand side. But in a subsequent issue, on October the 18th, 1993, several letters to the editor specifically focused on violence. Now, there was a small section that talked about violence in video games, specifically highlighting Mortal Kombat, but it was kind of a small part of a larger system of articles about the popularity of games at the time. But here are some of the things that people were saying in the letters to the editor. Now, you always have to understand that these things are curated by the editors of magazines like Time, and so they use them to focus on specific aspects of an issue. And these are some of the things that people were saying about video games. From Bob Brunden of Torrance, California, he wrote, "The video games of the 80s were the seed corn for teenage killers of today. A child could sit at his TV and kill literally hundreds of folks every hour with no concern or remorse." Or Wayne Socha, who added, "Video games should teach real lessons, beginning with the consequences and permanence of violence." In this environment, amongst these larger concerns about violence and violent crime and violent media that were permeating in other parts of American social and political life, entered Joseph Lieberman. Joe Lieberman at the time was a Democratic senator from Connecticut who became one of the big political advocates for concerns over violence in video games. Allegedly, he took it up as a cause at the behest of his former chief of staff named Bill Anderson, who brought video game violence to his attention when, at the request of Bill Anderson's son, Bill bought a copy of Mortal Kombat, and presumably for the Sega Genesis, and was shocked by its violent content, and then drew the attention to Senator Lieberman. And with that, on December the 1st, 1993, Joseph Lieberman held a press conference denouncing violent and sexual content in video games. Accompanying him were members of the National Parent-Teacher Association and a well-known TV personality by the name of Bob Keeshan, known to people of a certain age as Captain Kangaroo, who I'll mention a quotation from in a moment. But Senator Lieberman said during it, he said, quote, "We now require warning labels that could potentially damage children's bodies. Why not do so in a toy that can damage their minds?" And Lieberman demanded, he proposed to introduce, I keep saying the wrong things for that, he proposed that Congress mandate that the video games industry set up some kind of ratings or regulatory system, lest the federal government do it for them. That the government would mandate for the creation of a rating system. Emphasizing video games as dangerous toys. And as I just said, this quotation from Joe Lieberman. Here's another one from Bob Keeshan, again, aka Captain Kangaroo, holding up a cartridge from Blockbuster Video. He said, "These video games are not harmless toys. They can indeed cause emotional and other damage to a child." This press conference got media attention in national news. For example, it was covered in a 90-second segment on the nightly news program World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. And the segment, interspersed with these quotations from Keeshan and Lieberman, showed footage from Mortal Kombat, particularly a scene of Kano ripping out an opponent's heart as a fatality move, and the infamous Sub-Zero fatality in which he rips out a person's head with spinal cord attached, which I show so often as the first slide of all these episodes. So Lieberman, Keeshan, and other critics cited 2 games as specific targets of activist ire. Mortal Kombat was one, and why don't we find out what the next one is going to be next time. So before we move on to plugging for next week, I'll just give a moment to see if anybody has any questions in the chat. All right, well, as always, you can leave questions in the comments or feel free to reach out to me. So let's recap. I'm all out of sorts today. It must be the walls closing in on me. So let's recap. Between 1993 and 1994, there was a sudden media panic over violence and crime. However, the actual crime rate statistically did not align with the elevated tension to violence. And the panic over violence and various aspects like gun violence and drugs and gangs and other aspects triggered substantial changes in law enforcement and incarceration. And these had long-lasting consequences that we're still grappling with as a nation to this day. And that anxieties over violence in society shifted to concerns over violence in the media. And one of those media targets was video games. So we are getting so close to finally getting to the congressional hearings that address video game violence. But before we go there, next week, we're going to take a brief aside to focus on the 2 most notable targets of activist ire. I mentioned Mortal Kombat. There's the other one there, Night Trap. So I hope you'll tune in Friday, May the 15th at 4 p.m. When we'll be talking about Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, talking about them as games, their cultural impact and their impact on the industry, and we'll start whether they're any good or not. One of them is probably more well done than the other now, or at least more well played at this point. But if anyone has any questions, any comments about the show, you can leave them in the comments below, or you can follow me on Twitter at KDImpellizzeri, at KDIMPELLIZERI. For also more information about the series, you can follow the whole series on my website, as well as the link below where it has the full playlist to all 4 previous episodes in the series. And I hope that if you like what I'm doing here, you'll like and subscribe so you can keep track of the next time these things happen. It's a lot of fun putting these things together every week. I hope, as I always say, I hope that they help keep your mind off, all of this. And I thank you all, as always, for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and take care, everyone. See you around.